Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have another really very special guest with us this week. I'm so excited to introduce Erin Zimmerman to you. And she is a producer and visibility strategist. She works with individuals, small companies, and she is really fantastic. And she works with my podcast production company, and she's got a really beautiful story to share with us today. So thank you so much for being here, Erin. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you.
Well, we had a chance to talk. You have, I think what I love most about the stories that you're going to share with us today is the way that you approach and think about grief and loss. And I'm not going to give anything away right now, but I want to start with your earliest memory of the first time you experienced quite a significant loss with the stillborn birth of your brother. So let's start there. Kind of give us just talk a little bit about your family, ages, and what was happening when your brother was born.
So I was 4 years old. My sister, my twin sister, Meredith, and I were both 4 years old. And we were so excited to have another sibling. It was almost as if neither of us had a sibling in our heads because we just were best friends and we were together all the time. And it wasn't like we could take care of little baby, like I couldn't take care of little baby Meredith. And so we were so excited for a little baby in our lives. And then when we found out it was a boy, we were like, oh my God, we're super excited. My whole family was. We were ready. We were ready to just have the family expanded and love on this little baby. And unfortunately, he was at term and he was stillborn. Yeah, I mean, at the time, I feel like it took very little explaining from my parents for us to understand what was going on. Like we gathered it pretty quickly that he wasn't coming home. I mean, it's one of my first memories is this stillbirth and everything that happened with it. And like I said, I was 4 years old, but I remember so many pieces of it so clearly, like the funeral and when we found out, when my parents told me, and all of this other stuff around that time. Yeah.
How did your family, I mentioned this to you earlier that, and I might have mentioned on the podcast before, but Cheryl Strayed, a pretty famous author who wrote Wild, and her co-facilitator or co-presenter actually on this podcast, Steve Allman, called Dear Sugars, did a series on people who have lost a sibling at birth. And they called it the empty chair because of the way that can impact a family throughout time. This child that never got to grow up in the family. How do you think it impacted your family?
So up until just a couple of years ago, I didn't really think about it. Not that I didn't think about him. I didn't think about that time in my life. It comes up often, but I didn't think this was extremely significant because my rationale was this was a child that wasn't part of our family dynamic. And, I growing up, if I would mention it, there would be people who'd be like, okay, like, why would you be sad about it? Because, again, it was not a person that I knew. My brother Nathan was not a person I got to meet. But I really feel like we've always known him and like he helped change our family probably pretty quickly in a way that I again wasn't fully aware of at the time, but looking back I'm like, oh, like we became like we're a very tight-knit family now. Not that we weren't before, but I just feel like it's a noticeable difference of the before Nathan and after Nathan kind of thing, where I feel like I became more nurturing. And my sister and I are always told, not again, not always, but when this comes up, we're told about during the service and during this time, we became very nurturing towards my parents. And there are people who remember my sister and I patting my mom during the funeral service and laying our heads on her shoulder and things like that, where I feel like that's when a switch was flipped from I was a 4 year old child to I am also a caregiver as a 4 year old child, not because I was told I needed to or I was asked or anything like that. It just happened naturally. And my mom, I know that she went through a lot of grief, a lot of different kinds of grief for, carrying a child to full term and then birthing the child. And she and my dad were able to spend some time with Nathan before they had to leave the hospital. And so there's a lot there. And I don't think it was something where my mom was like, I must hide everything or anything like that. But since we were children, she was still very much momming, a very active mom, both my parents, very active parents with us and with their own work. But I don't remember my mom like shutting herself in her room for hours or days at a time. She was always there for us, but we all just I feel like we became more gentle with each other, closer. And that could just be a feeling because I don't know life any other way. It's strong to me. Like it's a very strong feeling for me that we came closer after.
Well, it's interesting because you said something really powerful of how you naturally took on that nurturing role with your mother during the funeral, right? Because, as children, I'm sure you could just feel that. And I write about this in my book, how oftentimes older siblings, right? I lost my brother in my 40s, that older siblings feel as though they need to swallow back their grief and be strong for everyone and become that nurturer to the parents who have had this profound loss. So it's so fascinating to me that at such a young age, you naturally took on that role that followed you throughout your life. You said that people think of you as Mama Bear. So, and also could be part of your personality anyway, that just came out at this really early age, that you had to provide that comfort to your parents who had had this significant loss. Then your family did expand and you had a very healthy brother that came a year later, right?
Yes, Ian, he did.
I want to speed up time.
Yes.
And you had a profound loss of a best friend about 8 years ago, you said. Can you tell us about Bruno and what happened?
Yeah. So Bruno, Anthony Bruno, lovingly referred to as Bruno, was almost lifelong best friends with my husband. And so we were pretty close. He met a tragic ending, unexpected, on his wedding night after his reception. He and his wife were in a taxi cab on the way to their hotel. And as they were getting ready to pay or get out, of the taxi driver said some words that were not very nice to Bruno's new wife. And Bruno hit the back of the headrest of the taxi driver. So didn't hit the taxi driver, hit the back of his headrest, and was really understandably angry. But then he said, you know what, I'm gonna get out. He and his wife decided you need to take a walk around the block, you need to cool off. And so he did that. And he was like, I'll be up to the room shortly. So she went up to their hotel room and he went on a walk around the block. It was late at night. They had been drinking some, celebrating, obviously. And unfortunately, the taxi driver hollered for help. And there was an off duty police officer at the hotel that they were staying at. This off duty police officer was not wearing a uniform, he was in civilian clothes. And he had done a few things that weren't quite up to standards, expected standards, protocol for being off duty police officers, including sorry, this is hard to rehash, but he didn't have a radio walkie on him, so he couldn't call for backup. He did have a firearm on him, and there were some other things, including, he was in civilian clothing. So he chased my friend Bruno around the block, which was, downtown. It was dark outside. It was late. And so when he caught up to him, being in civilian clothes, Bruno thought he was being attacked and a fight ensued. And there were a few people around who did take phone video, there's surveillance video, but what ended up happening was Bruno figured out that this was a police officer after he had beat the guy up a little bit. Like they'd been back and forth, but it was very clear that Bruno, a very strong man, physically, mentally, emotionally, was overpowering this guy. But this police officer then had him pinned down. And so Bruno said, please, please don't hurt me. Like I understand now that you're a police officer. Like this guy didn't announce that he was an officer when he came. Like there were just so much went wrong so quickly. But he ended up claiming self-defense. The police officer ended up, even though he had Bruno pinned down to the ground, shooting him point blank in the chest and killing him.
I'm sorry. Just take a breath.
Thanks. I don't recount this story often. In the city that we're from, people know the story quite well. They had their opinions early, and so there's only so much talking about it that does anything. So we haven't, besides my husband and I talking about it, and we don't rehash the details often. This is the first time I've recounted it in a very long time.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. It's so horrific. I can't imagine on so many different levels how horrific this story is. Tell me how it impacted your life. What happened after the death of your friend?
So, as I mentioned in the retelling of the story, he's a very strong guy, firefighter. And he would fireman carry my husband around. He just let physically, mentally, emotionally, just one of the strongest people that I'd ever met. And so following his death, I have never skipped a grieving process. It's not, and sometimes I don't go through it linearly when I lose people. Things come and go. Grieving is different for everyone, but I have always found myself going through the different steps of the grieving process, whether they're in order, whether they're years apart, whatever it is. But very early on, following the death of Bruno, I thought to myself, well, how can I carry on his legacy? Like, he died at 26 years old. And so I'm like, this is too early to lose him, but what can I carry on for him? And I just always think about his strength, his brute strength, his every piece of him. And so, even in those last moments where he was being strong for his wife, his brand new wife, he's being strong to save his own life as best as he can. And so I always remember that if I'm feeling weak physically, mentally, or emotionally, I just think you got to be strong like Bruno. And I do that. Like, even if it's the tiniest thing, if I'm in the gym and I'm like, I can't get this last rep, or if I'm doing something new physically with my body and I'm like, oh, I don't know, like hot yoga. I did this when I was trying hot yoga for the first time. By the way, I haven't gone back to hot yoga, but I finished that one time because I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is unbearable, but I'm strong. I don't know that Bruno would have stuck it out in a hot yoga class. He probably would have been like, hell no, get me out of here. But I just thought, I need to have, that the mental ferociousness, that real, I just keep saying strength, but that strength of Bruno. And it's carried me through a lot. It doesn't make me skip being scared or stopping doing something because it's not right for me. It's not one of those things where it pushes me past uncomfortability to the point where I'm like ignoring my insides. It's a reminder that you don't have to fight constantly, but he fought till the very end, and I can do that to get through the little things or the seemingly big things. And it's carried me through. And I do tell people often that if I feel like I can't make it through something, I just remember my friend Bruno. And so that's a nice way to continue bringing his name up, bringing up his legacy through my eyes, and just living as best as I can without him.
I mean, this is one of the things that I loved about the different stories you were telling me, is because you have this way of the multiple losses you've experienced in your life, of how you take that legacy, and it becomes like this thread that you pull through your life. And I feel like from your younger brother, and that earliest memory brought out this nurturing side of yourself. And Bruno is bringing out this strength. But I want to pause on Bruno, because there's something about this story too that I think is really important. And that is that Bruno was your husband's childhood friend, and you became friends with him, obviously, because you got to know him through your husband. What was it like for you grieving this friend that you had also become friends with, but also that your husband had lost one of his best friends? I'm assuming you were friends with his wife as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
What,
still really close with her.
so that experience before you were able to get where you are now, what was that experience like for you?
That experience, it was shocking more than anything. It's one of those things where my husband and I, we had already at that point, we were still engaged. But at that point, we had already, each of us individually had seen loss while we were together. But this was more powerful and still is to this day because my husband has lost family members since, but it was the first friend, the first close friend I think that either of us had lost. And because he was so close, they were so close throughout their entire lives. And, there would be times where they would separate and come back together, but it was a shock. And it's still, anytime that it comes up in my head, it's a shock. But it changed a lot of things for us. Like it was the first time that we were really talking through the feelings of it all because I mean, not only did he lose one of his closest friends, but it was in such a tragic way and with different instances of police brutality. That was another thing where it's like, oh, this is also forefront and center because of how the things are being reported or not reported or how the trajectory of things were going at the time. So it was very much like media frenzy, unjust things happen obviously that night, but then around it after the fact. And so it was a lot of different layers that we were trying to get through together. And I feel like we very much communication wise, my husband and I have gotten much more on the same page. And we are very good at showing empathy towards one another and listening a lot because of this. We have a friend group that we are much closer to now than we were before, where they were all friends in high school and they had all kind of grown apart a little bit. We would go to weddings and things like that, but it wasn't hanging out all the time. And now we see each other a lot more and we're much closer. And it's, Bruno brought us together in the worst possible way, the worst kind of loss, but he brought us all together. And like I said, the communication between my husband and I mean, not that we wouldn't be communicating like we do now, but it was one of those things where this event, you can definitely tell that this is where a lot of that empathy and really trying to process and realizing that you can't process it all at once. And again, you can't process things linearly all the time. And it's just,
I just feel struck by first the loss of your brother when you were 4 years old, and then the loss of this friend at I mean, he was also so young. Most of us don't experience anywhere near those kind of losses at that age, but plus it was so tragic. I mean, wedding night and murdered by a cop. Did that have, I mean, both of these are very traumatic experiences. Has it impacted you in any way around being fearful or ensuring, I guess that's the question, more fearful of life?
no, it more like it made me angry. Obviously, I get angry about it all the time, but it's for shorter bursts now. But it like ignited something in me, more empathy for other people, more passion to like help other people, realizing that, again, like I mentioned before, police brutality is getting more attention and realizing that, yes, it hit close to home for me, but now that has become, part of something that I support is seeing it all over the place, but joining the efforts to try to end it. I mean, as best as you can as a civilian, try to make sure that policies are followed, things like that. And so it ignited that kind of anger and passion in me that it's like, I want to see change. And at the same time, with each death, and especially, I feel like, especially the traumatic ones where like you're not expecting it, it just makes me love harder. Anytime I think about these people that I've lost, I think, wow, if I could have loved them harder while they were here, or if I had the chance to love them harder. And so it, even if it's just a blip of time, it helps me recalibrate in that way. Fear pops up, of course, but it's not like his murder made me more fearful to walk outside at night or anything like that. As a woman, that's something that's always in the back of my head. And so it's like, I feel like this has not helped me, but I feel like I'm now more concerned, not worried, but more concerned about the people around me and how they're living in their awareness. A lot of it is like being more aware.
I think that's what I mean, because I know that when I lost my brother, I think for those of us who experience a premature loss, I call it premature, even though I don't think anyone really dies a second earlier than intended, which
Mhm.
is, I know that's very controversial and I don't want to go into why I think that, but when we lose people prematurely, when, when we feel like their lives have been snipped or clipped short, and I feel like the more violent, tragic deaths, like your friend Bruno, I think sometimes it can be more difficult to grapple with the emotion that come up around that because of that anger, because we know that it was such an avoidable death. Like with sudden deaths, like sometimes with car accidents or aneurysms or some of these other things that happen, doesn't feel quite as anger is what always comes up in these violent deaths, because I don't know how else to describe the emotions that come up for people and that would come up for me if somebody took somebody I loved in a violent way. I remember I interviewed this woman for my book whose sister was murdered by her husband when she was leaving him, and how long it took her. God, see, I get so emotional and how long it took her to transform that anger into something positive. I mean, I really think when you talk to her, it took her a solid 5 years just for the veil of darkness to lift. And you speak about the anger. I mean, at 4 years old, when you lose your brother to a stillbirth, that nobody could have prevented that, right? That is just a very tragic death that occurred. But in a situation like this, I mean, I can imagine the anger that swirled around you from his friends, his parents, his devastated wife. You were so young. It's hard enough to navigate those complex emotions when you've been around for a while. But when you are really just young adults and just starting out, and these things are not supposed to happen, they're just not supposed to happen. How did you navigate it as a group of friends? I mean, I just keep imagining where I was at 26 years old. I didn't have a care in the world. I was just starting my professional life. And I just really would love for you to be able to share how you navigated the anger and also the collective anger of the group mentality, because sometimes that can really make things even more intense and difficult to manage.
Yeah. It brought our friend group, this particular friend group, closer, which I feel is a blessing. This whole thing, blessing and a curse. There are always blessings that pop up out of it. It doesn't make me grateful for any of it. If I could go back and change all of it, I would. And unfortunately or unfortunately, that's still something that my husband and I discuss semi-regularly, is what we could have done different. And sometimes I feel like that's just what we need to do to process it a little further, or to get, quit spinning in our own heads. But when it comes to this community, this friend group, Bruno's family and his wife, we were already close with his wife. She had been part of that same friend group. She had actually known my husband since he was little as well. So it was, very close knit. Right after it happened, it was one of those things where just every day it just didn't seem real. Either the morning after it happened, I'm pretty sure that same day we all got together and it was mostly just sitting in silence, but being together. We did a lot of that, especially in the first handful of weeks and months, and even up to the first couple of years, where we'd get together and it's let's get together and watch the football game. And so, Bruno would come up at least once during each of those. But in that first week, I remember I feel like we spent almost every day with these people. And it was probably less about the people we were with and more about being around other people, because we didn't want our minds to go where they were going. And I think that was what it was for everyone. But it became about being around those specific people who had the memory from the night before, like all of these memories from his wedding the night before, and as well as everything else going back to, 5 years old. That's when my husband met Bruno. And so 21 years of memories, and then just not having that person anymore to go back in time with. Well, you have these other folks that can remember Bruno in a similar way, never in the same way, but in a similar way. The day of his funeral, I mean, I think we spent the evening before together with all these friends. And then, we went to his funeral. We made sure we were trying to keep his wife as comfortable as she could be, but she's a very independent woman. And so it was one of those things where we're all trying to figure out how to nurture her while also nurturing each other and ourselves. And it was a difficult time to navigate because you have people who really didn't want to talk about it. She seemed like she was doing okay, but I think it was because of her distraction of everything going on around her and making sure that everything was as perfect as possible. It was all also difficult navigating because we wanted to make sure that his family, Bruno has two sisters and his parents are both living. And so we were trying to make sure that we were there for them as well. There seemed to be some blame going on behind the scenes with that. And so it was very difficult to navigate. However, when we were all together reminiscing, there it was laughter until we cried. And then it was crying, but then it was crying until we laughed because the times with Bruno were all over the place. Like they were great and they were awful, but they were hilariously awful. And it was nice to be around a group of friends that had those kind of memories where it's like, oh, this was the real Bruno. It wasn't the edited Bruno for work or for around his parents or anything like that. And so we've been able to carry that through in these friendships. We don't talk about him every time we're around, and each of these friends have grieved in different ways and their processing is different. A lot of them don't think about it almost at all anymore. And each of our brains works differently. Like I said, my husband and I still, every once in a while, will process it. I know he thinks about it a lot every day. And so I'm grateful when he chooses to speak up and talk with me about what happened and about just his memories of Bruno. And a lot of times it'll start and we'll just keep rolling. But this group of friends is a second family to us in a way that I don't think it would have happened without this tragic loss. And so I'm grateful that we're all together. I just wish it was under different, better circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine because I'm sure too that when we were talking earlier, I'm sure that, the cop was brought to trial, right? The court, like the whole thing, I'm sure was excruciating. I have to know, did his wife go on to marry somebody new? Oh,
She did.
good.
She
Oh, good.
We're very close with her. She actually moved away from our hometown finally. It took like I think it was just within the last couple of years she moved like way out of state, and which is great because you keep passing these places. You have memories with Bruno and you have a memory of his death in one specific place. And then she has the memories of the entire, the trial and everything. Almost as soon as she moved, she met someone and they are now married with
Oh,
an adorable toddler.
oh, good. I'm so happy to hear that my brother's wife still has yet to remarry. It's been almost 9 years. So I love that she has been able to start her life anew. I want to go to the next piece that we talked about because I feel like the power of your stories are, again, going back to what we had talked about earlier. You've got this incredible outlook on life and death and dying, and perhaps that is because you were introduced to it at such a young age. What struck me about your stories, the strength that you have, because I can tell you're a joyful person. I can feel it. I can see it in your face, even as you were talking about Bruno and the way that you keep his legacy alive. But you lost your grandmother, and even though she lived to be, 92, I think you said, right? Sounds like she had a beautiful life, but she was very important to you. And I always say I lost my grandmom at 95. So even though they've lived this beautiful life, I think it's a gentler goodbye because they have had this fabulous life, but also there's a deep pain because this person that you've had your entire life who had such a profound influence on you is no longer with you. And you talked about the legacy that you keep alive with your grandmother as well. And so can you talk about your grand just a little bit and also her legacy that you also have kept alive in your own life?
Yeah, I can. Real quick, I just want to mention that while we've been talking, it's not like I talk about death like constantly. And so it's not something that I usually am connecting the dots with, but I've lost more than these three people. I've lost many people in my life. But I'm just noticing this thread as you and I are talking, because the first death that I remember, the ways that it changed me, I didn't notice at the time. It took me looking back on it. And then with Bruno's death, and I think that's why these are the three that are most impactful. Like, I'm realizing it after the fact. With Bruno's death, I very much thought to myself, very specifically, like, he's so young. How can I keep his legacy alive? And then I realized, oh, I've been doing that just naturally throughout my life as that was happening. I was just thinking back to the other deaths and what I've carried forward from each of these people. And then with my granny, she very much, like, she was one of my absolute best friends, especially, in the last 10-ish years, I believe, of her life. But with her, I was thinking how to carry on her legacy before she passed away. So it's one of those things where it wasn't anticipatory and like, oh, she's going to die soon, but she was older. And so I was just like, gosh, how can I keep carrying her? She's one of my favorite people in the entire world. How can I carry her with me? And so, yes, my granny, she's chosen family. I have other grandmothers that are actual blood, but she's chosen, but she's real family, my granny is. And I met her, I think I was 3 or 4 months old, and she was very quick, very much our family. And so into high school and college, my sister and I would visit her because she lived in Los Angeles. And so we would go on adventures, and I would call her and I would FaceTime her. Her son would help. Now he's in his 70s. He would help her with all the technology. So when we were across the country from each other, we could still talk with each other. But it was a really wonderful relationship in that when I was younger, it was a nurturing one, but she was always, I think our relationship was less grandmother to grandchild and more friend, more guide. But she would never have said that. She thought she was a bad mother. She never identified very well with being a mother, even though she was a mother. She divorced young when you're not supposed to. She questioned everything. She did what she wanted throughout her entire life. And learning that when I was in college and past college, like talking with her, realizing that she still had a photo of herself and who she called the love of her life, who she didn't even marry. Like, she still had this photo, even though after she had this love of her life, she then got married and then got divorced and then lived so many years past that. But she showed me this photo. She rode roller coasters up into her 90s. And then when she was alive, she lived very fully, very vibrantly, very, I don't care what other people think. She had dirty jokes and she would giggle all the time and she would give me a hard time and she was sarcastic. And we just had a really wonderful dynamic that wasn't just fun and friendly, but it was like, oh, I want to be like her when I grow up. I still say that. I want to be just like Granny when I grow up. And actually, her son gave me some of her moo-moos, like those loose night dresses, and I wear them. I'm not going to just let them hang in my closet just to like look at. I'm like, no, I'm going to be more like her. So I do. I wear the moo-moos. Wear the moo-moo, friends, if you have them. But she was just wild and free. And when we lost her, it was not a surprise. She was in a rehabilitation facility for a while and heart failure was involved. But I knew for years before she left that I wanted to, like, I just kept saying, I want to be more like you when I grow up. And, the first iteration of my business was called Elephant Social because she loved elephants. She had adopted a couple at the Wichita Zoo and she had figurines of elephants and she had paintings by elephants up in her house. We have one of them now. It's just like this fantastic connection to animals, especially elephants. And she just was fascinated with, how they nurtured one another and humans and how they communicate and just everything about elephants. And so that became like the first iteration of my business was Elephant Social whenever I first started freelancing, like jumped out of corporate. But then past that, I've called her my guide, Granny. Like, sure, she made all kinds of missteps in her life. We all do, but I still see her as someone that I have always and will always look up to because she questioned everything and because she loved so hard and because she made so many mistakes and then admitted that she made the mistakes and then just kept going anyway. Like she's not someone who was like, oh, I made a mistake. I can't do this thing anymore. Or, oh, I did that really horribly. It's not for me. It was like, no, she kept making the mistakes over and over. And in that way, she's this free spirit that I aspire more to be in business, in life, everywhere. And those are the things that I also talk about the most whenever, when folks are asking me, how is it that you can make these mistakes and keep going? Or how is it that, you can keep going in business or all these other things? It's like I'm hard headed like Granny. And then everyone learns about Granny
Well, I
and everyone
see it.
comes to know her still.
I was going to say, I see an elephant hanging behind you on the
You
wall.
do.
Yeah, I do. And I love that you talk about the elephant representing nurturing, which brings us back to when you were 4. I just think it's interesting. I love to see the themes in people's lives because I think we don't often connect those dots of the things that we learn and how we take those experiences and it impacts and influences us throughout our life, whether in a negative or positive way. It can go both ways. I can't tell you how many times I'm a therapist, of course, so I can't tell you every single time the stories that I hear where a traumatic event will have happened and someone will say, I've never been the same since. And I think that wouldn't it be so boring if we remain the same throughout our lifetime? The things that impact us, the joyful moments, but also the traumatic moments are what really change us. People have heard me say on the podcast, not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. Because we know there are a lot of people in deep pain walking around the earth. And when that deep pain is external, they can create a lot of harm to others. When it's internal, they can create a lot of self-harm. And on the flip side of that, when I'm listening to your stories, these traumatic events have changed you, right? All of these events change us. And listening to you, it feels like you are so aware of how fleeting life is. And even to be thinking about your granny before her passing, of how can you carry on her legacy, is pretty unique. A lot of people, me included, when my mom was getting older, I would sit in my car and cry sometimes thinking about her imminent death because my brother's death did not impact me in a great way. It did make me more fearful of losing other people in my life. Of course, writing through that grief has helped me a lot, but I worry so much about my surviving siblings. And so I think that what I love about your story is really raising awareness of our mindset. And the words aren't coming to me, but do you know what I'm trying to say? That instead of becoming more fearful, what you did was really think about what these human beings have brought to your life and how those experiences can pull you forward. And I just think it's a very unique way to take those experiences and create something really meaningful and positive from that.
Thank you. Thank you. And a lot of this, like, I'm just realizing as we're talking, like I said, is how, like, I went through the different stages of, death was happening to me. But then in the moment, it's like, okay, now I'm realizing right now that things have to change while this is happening. And then it's like, oh, sometimes I anticipate because we're all, death is a part of life. We all go through life and we all go through death. And I'm not someone who doesn't go through the anticipatory grief spiral. I do that too. You were talking about how you were thinking about your mom and things like that. I not all the time. I sometimes it feels like it's all the time, but I do go through that. But it's in moments like that where I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I ever going to do when my parents are gone? Or like if something happens to my family right now, especially, when COVID began, I was like, no one go near each other. I was very much concerned. And before I used to look at this as worry. Oh, I'm so worried all the time, but I'm not. It's like a deeper concern for the safety of folks around me and making sure that I'm doing all that I can to make them as safe as possible without it completely tearing my life apart. So when I go into these sometimes spirals of the anticipatory grief and thinking like, oh, what would life be like without them? Or I'm going to miss this the most. That's when I take a deep breath, and it doesn't work all the time, but it does work sometimes for me. I'm able to take a deep breath and think, okay, when that person does go, what will I carry with me? And I've been using that more as it wasn't even a tool I was aware of really fully until I'm just now saying it out loud. But it's especially in, again, since COVID started, where I was like, oh my gosh, I could lose anyone at the drop of a hat and not even be able to see them in person again, not be able to hug them. So that's when I take a deep breath and I think about what I can carry on when that does happen. If that does happen in my lifetime, it may not. Like I may not lose these people in my lifetime. So there's no reason to like worry and spiral. And so that kind of brings me back down. It grounds me a little bit into that. Well, I can be concerned for their safety, but I don't need to worry about their every living moment. And then I can choose to text them or call them or show up at their house if they're nearby. And so that's kind of like I stop, I think about how I can continue the legacy when, if and when it happens in my lifetime. And then if I have space in my schedule right then, or I schedule in I need to call mom.
Yeah, and I love that because it can deepen it definitely my brother's death did that. I mean, I've always had a deep appreciation for the people in my life and never get off the phone without saying I love you ever. But I think that when he died, I got it at a whole different, I got how fleeting life is and that don't take 1 second for granted with the people that we love. And I had to really work on the worry piece, especially with my younger brother when he would be traveling. I'm way better now. It's been 8 years, but I was very fearful. And he would be like, "You're driving me crazy. You got to stop doing this." I'm like, "Please don't go on this trip." It was ridiculous, but but that was my trauma response to losing my brother. And I had to really work on that. I had to, for a long time. And then, of course, losing my mom. But my mom was older and she had suffered a stroke. And so there was a lot of medical reasons where people will say, I've heard people say, well, it was a blessing because they were in a lot of pain. That's true. And you can grieve the loss at the same time, right? You grieve both, but it's different because you do, at least for me, it was very challenging and difficult and painful to watch my mother be in all that pain for so long, so it's just different. But I am noticing time and I want to bring us to a close. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your outlook because it is incredibly uplifting, quite frankly. And I really appreciate it. And I hope it was uplifting for all of you who are listening as well. My last question that I ask everybody that I interview is, what does self-love look like for you?
The first thing that came to mind was grounding. And I mean, it's not something that I grasp all the time, but making sure that when I'm spiraling or when I feel anxious or depressed or anything like that, doing like using the tools that I have found work for me and just grounding in the moment. I know it doesn't sound luxurious like a spa day or anything like that. 8 hours of sleep helps too for self-care. I notice a huge difference when I get 8 hours, but like it's stopping. It's closing my eyes if I need to in the moment. It's taking a deep breath if I need to in the moment. Like just realizing, okay, I have this list of tools in the back of my head that I can pull out at any point in time and bring myself back to earth because that's where I am. And I've got this one life and I got to live it and I can't live in anxiety. And I have realized it a lot more in even just the last 3 months because I went through a really rough time in my life in the last handful of months. And so, any grounding techniques that I have gathered and then I have found really work for me, even just putting my feet flat on the floor or going outside and putting my feet in the grass. I love that. Or when I wake up, the very first thing that I do is go outside on my deck and do this towards the sun. If the sun's not out, it's okay. I still know that it's there. Those are the types of little tools that I use to ground myself and bring myself back to earth and realize I'm human, I'm alive, and I can get through this.
Yeah, I love that because grounding, I think, and I don't know if listeners are all familiar with that terminology, but it's bringing ourselves to the present moment. And we seldom live in the present. We very much live in the past and in the future, which creates our anxiety for the future of the unknown and depression from the past and sad memories. But when we can do what you're talking about, I do the same thing, as a matter of fact. and if you can't get outside and take your shoes off and really feel the earth under your feet, you can even take a key and rub your finger against it because it's a sensation. It's very tactile, right? And it brings you back into the moment. So I really appreciate that. It sounds so simple, but it's amazing the impact it can have if we feel ourselves, as you said, starting to spiral. Another technique that I've used a lot with myself and also other people, that when you find yourself especially when you're in depths of grief and you are crying and you feel like you cannot pull it together, you can stare at something in your environment and you start describing it in great detail. Whether it's a light you're looking at, if it's a pillow, it doesn't even, the object doesn't matter. The point is, it pulls you out of that trauma response to the person that you have lost or whatever it is that you happen to be grieving or spiraling about. And it's another centering, it's another grounding technique, but it can be super powerful, specifically when you really feel like you are coming off the rails. And you continuously do that until, so let's say that you're describing something, then I say, okay, now I want you to go back and I want you to try to still get into that state you were just in. And it's almost impossible to go back. And then you go ahead and you start describing the object again. And you do that until you really feel like you have calmed yourself. Super powerful. Anyways, I want to thank you, Erin, so much for being here, sharing your story. And you can find all of Erin's contact information in the show notes. And I want to thank you all for listening. And I hope this brought you a dose of hope. And we will see you here next week. Bye for now.